My name is Glenda Moore. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my life, I've lived in Portland, Oregon, surrounded by warehouses, freight schedules, and conversations about contracts that usually happened in rooms I wasn't invited into. The company at the center of this story belonged to my family long before it ever had a formal boardroom or polished branding. It began as a small logistics operation my grandfather built with 2 trucks and a stubborn belief that reliability mattered more than scale. Growing up, the business was always there, like a quiet background rhythm to our lives. But there was also something else that shaped the way I understood my place in that world. My father always told me to stay out of the family business. Not harshly, not angrily, just matter-of-factly. Growing up, I was told the company belonged to the men in our family. I respected that boundary for many years. But when circumstances changed, I realized I understood more about the business than anyone expected. For most people who met me during those years, I was easy to define. I was the daughter who handled paperwork when someone was short-staffed, the niece who organized the meeting notes, the quiet one in the corner of the office who made sure shipments were logged correctly and invoices actually matched the numbers. Useful, but not important. Reliable, but not strategic. People tend to assume that when someone stays quiet for a long time, it's because they don't have anything meaningful to say. What they rarely consider is that sometimes silence comes from watching, from noticing patterns, from understanding the difference between what people say a business is and how it actually survives day after day. This story isn't about revenge. No one gets humiliated. No one gets shouted at. There's no dramatic boardroom explosion or sudden twist of fate. What happened instead unfolded slowly, through decisions that looked small at the time, through information that most people ignored, and through a kind of patience that people often mistake for weakness. Over the years, I learned something very simple about power. The people who appear invisible inside a system are often the ones who understand it the most clearly. And when the moment finally came where the company needed someone who truly understood how everything worked, the answer turned out to be different from what everyone expected. What I'm going to share with you is not a story about winning. It's a story about clarity, about quiet decisions, and about what happens when someone who has spent years being underestimated finally stops trying to prove anything at all. I'm telling it now because enough time has passed that I can look back without anger, just perspective, and maybe a little understanding. Before we begin, I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a place, at work, in a family, or even in a group of friends, where people decided who you were long before they actually knew you? If you had walked into our office 10 years ago and asked anyone who Glenda Moore was, you would have received almost identical answers. Glenda? Oh, she handles the paperwork. She keeps the schedules organized. She's good with details. None of those descriptions was wrong. They just weren't complete. Our company operated out of a low brick building on the edge of Portland's industrial district. From the outside, when they yell, it looked like dozens of other logistics offices scattered along the highway. Large garage doors, stacks of shipping pallets, the constant hum of trucks arriving and leaving. Inside, though, the structure of power was very clear. My father ran operations. My uncle handled partnerships and contracts. My older cousins rotated through management roles, learning the real side of the business. And me? I sat at a desk near the back window with a computer that was always open to spreadsheets. I was the one who confirmed delivery logs, the one who corrected the invoice numbers, the one who noticed when fuel expenses didn't match mileage reports. But those things were considered administrative details, not decisions. That distinction mattered. No one ever said outright that I wasn't capable of more responsibility. My family wasn't openly dismissive of people. In fact, they often complimented how dependable I was. But there's a particular kind of boundary that doesn't need to be spoken out loud. It's built through small habits. When important conversations started, someone would casually say, "Glenda, can you print the updated schedule?" When financial reviews happened, I'd be asked to prepare the documents, but not stay for the discussion. At first, I assumed that was normal. I was younger than most of the others, and experience takes time. But as the years passed, something became increasingly clear. The men in my family were being trained to lead the company. I was being trusted to support it. There's a subtle difference between those two paths. One leads to the room where decisions are made. The other makes sure the room is organized before anyone arrives. The strange thing is, I didn't resent it. Not in the way people might expect, partly because I genuinely liked the work. There's something satisfying about systems running smoothly, about knowing that shipments arrive where they're supposed to, that drivers get paid correctly, that clients receive accurate reports. But there was another reason I stayed quiet about my role. Working in the background gave me something that very few people noticed: time to observe. When you're the person responsible for the documents, you end up seeing everything eventually. Contracts pass across your desk before they're signed. Expense reports show up before accountants review them. You learn where the business is strong and where it quietly struggles. Over time, patterns began forming in my mind. Which suppliers were reliable? Which clients paid late but negotiated aggressively? Which months consistently caused cash flow pressure? None of this information felt particularly powerful at the time. It just felt interesting, like assembling a puzzle no one had asked me to solve. My father used to stop by my desk occasionally on his way out for the evening. He'd glance at whatever spreadsheet I was reviewing and give me a small nod of approval. "You're good with details," he would say, and I believed that was the role he genuinely thought suited me best. To him, I was dependable. To my cousins, I was helpful. To the rest of the office, I was the quiet constant who made sure the numbers lined up. Invisibility isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like appreciation. Sometimes it feels like stability. But the more comfortable people become with someone quietly holding everything together, the less they question what that person might actually understand about the system as a whole. Looking back now, I realize something important about that period of my life. I wasn't just the quiet one in the office. I was the one person who saw every piece of the machine while everyone else was focused only on their own part of it. At the time, though, I didn't think that mattered. Not yet. Because the first moment that made me realize how firmly my role had been defined came from something so small that almost everyone else forgot it immediately. Almost everyone. But I didn't. And that small moment became the first quiet crack in the story everyone believed about me. The moment that stayed with me didn't happen during a major meeting. It didn't involve a big decision, or an argument, or anything dramatic enough that someone would remember it years later. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Those mornings were usually the busiest time in the office. Drivers came in early to confirm routes, shipment schedules were being updated constantly, and someone was always walking past my desk asking for a printed form or a revised invoice. I liked those hours. When everything moved quickly, people relied on the systems I had built to keep track of things. Spreadsheets, delivery logs, maintenance schedules, small structures that made the chaos manageable. That morning, my father and uncle were meeting with a potential regional partner. It was the kind of partnership that could expand our delivery routes into neighboring states. I knew about the meeting because I had prepared the documents for it. Contract drafts, projected fuel costs, delivery timelines. While organizing the files, I noticed something that didn't quite fit. The proposal assumed a fuel pricing structure that had already begun shifting. It wasn't obvious unless you had been watching the weekly reports carefully, which I had. If the numbers in the contract stayed the same, our margin would slowly shrink over the next year. Not catastrophically, but enough to matter. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the spreadsheet on my screen. Then I stood up, walked down the short hallway, and gently knocked on the conference room door. My father opened it halfway. Inside, I could see the potential partner sitting at the table with my uncle, coffee cups in front of them and folders spread across the polished surface. "Sorry," I said quietly. "I just noticed something in the fuel projections. The price index changed last week. It might affect the margin in Section 4. I wasn't interrupting to challenge anyone, just offering information." My father looked at me for a second, not annoyed, just mildly surprised that I had stepped into the room during a meeting. Then he gave a small smile, the kind adults give when a child says something well-intentioned but unnecessary. "That's okay, Glenda," he said gently. "We've got it handled." He closed the door again. That was it. The entire interaction probably lasted less than 15 seconds. When the meeting ended, an hour later, the men walked out laughing about something unrelated. The contract draft stayed exactly the same. No one mentioned the fuel numbers again, and for the rest of the office, the day continued exactly as usual. But something about that moment stayed with me. Not because my suggestion had been ignored. People ignore suggestions all the time. That's normal in any workplace. What stayed with me was the tone, the quiet certainty that the conversation inside that room belonged to a world I wasn't really part of. Not because I lacked information, but because I wasn't expected to participate. That evening, after most of the office had gone home, I opened the financial projection again and adjusted the fuel numbers myself, just to see what would happen. The margin narrowed exactly the way I suspected. It wasn't a disaster, but it meant the partnership would earn us noticeably less than everyone expected. I closed the spreadsheet and leaned back in my chair. For the first time, I felt a small, unfamiliar thought forming. Not resentment, not frustration, just curiosity. If the numbers were this easy for me to see from a desk outside the meeting room, how many other details were quietly slipping past the people making the decisions. The thought passed quickly. I told myself it didn't matter. After all, I wasn't the one responsible for those decisions. My role was simply to make sure everything stayed organized, reliable, useful, invisible. And that's exactly how things continued for a while. Except once you notice a pattern, once a small moment reveals how people truly see you, it becomes harder not to notice it again the next time it happens, and the next time, and the next. Slowly, without anyone intending it, those small moments began to stack together. Each one is easy to dismiss. Each one is easy to forget. Unless you were the person quietly standing in the doorway when it happened. After that Tuesday morning, nothing visibly changed. The office still opened at 7. The trucks still left the yard in steady lines of diesel and paperwork. My desk is still filled each day with spreadsheets, delivery logs, and contracts waiting to be filed. On the surface, life inside the company continued exactly the way it always had. But something subtle had shifted inside me. Not anger, just awareness. Once you see how a system quietly categorizes people, it becomes difficult to stop noticing the ways that system reinforces itself. And in our office, the pattern was almost invisible, unless you were paying attention. For example, there was a meeting every Thursday afternoon where operational updates were discussed: fuel usage, route efficiency, seasonal contracts, and equipment maintenance. Technically, I prepared nearly half the data that the meeting relied on, but I never attended. Instead, around 3 o'clock, someone would walk over to my desk. Glenda, can you print the updated route report? Or Kittain, Glenda, can you double-check the invoice totals before the meeting? I would hand them the documents, watch them walk toward the conference room, and then return to whatever task I had been doing. No one excluded me deliberately. In fact, everyone was perfectly polite. But politeness and inclusion aren't always the same thing. Sometimes the most effective boundaries are the ones people assume are natural. One afternoon, my cousin Aaron stopped by my desk while reviewing some shipment reports. Aaron was 2 years older than me and had recently been given more responsibility in operations. He was a good person, confident, energetic, and genuinely proud to be part of the family business. He tapped the spreadsheet on my screen. "How do you keep track of all this?" he asked. "Mostly patterns," I said. "If you watch the routes long enough, you start seeing where delays usually happen." He laughed. "That's why you're perfect for this job." Perfect for this job? At the time, I nodded and smiled the way people do during casual conversations. But later that evening, those 4 words replayed in my mind longer than they should have. Perfect for this job, not operations, not a strategy, not leadership, just this, the quiet desk, the spreadsheets, the details. I told myself it didn't bother me. And in many ways, that was true, because staying in the background also gave me something no one else seemed to value: perspective. When people believe someone is only responsible for administrative work, they tend to speak freely around that person. They assume the information won't travel anywhere important. So I heard things: discussions about new contracts while someone leaned against my desk, frustrated comments about suppliers who were becoming unreliable, concerns about rising fuel costs and seasonal fluctuations. None of it was secret, but most of it wasn't being connected to a bigger picture either. And that was the interesting part. Every evening, after the office emptied out, I would sometimes review the week's numbers one more time before shutting down my computer. Not because anyone asked me to, just because I was curious. Gradually, the business began to make sense to me in a deeper way. I could see which decisions created stability and which ones quietly introduced risk. Still, I kept those thoughts to myself, partly because I had already learned something important about the culture inside our company. Speaking up from the wrong position didn't change the outcome. It only reminded people that you weren't supposed to be speaking in the first place. So I did what many people do when they find themselves in a role that feels smaller than their understanding. I adapted. I told myself there was no reason to challenge the structure that already existed. The company was functioning. My family was proud of what they had built, and my place inside that structure was comfortable enough. Reliable, useful, invisible. Except over time, something else began to happen. When people grow accustomed to someone quietly supporting everything around them, they sometimes begin to assume that support will always be there, no matter what. And that assumption can slowly turn respect into something slightly different, something more casual, more dismissive, not cruel, just careless. The kind of carelessness that leads to moments where someone forgets the person in the room might understand more than they realize. And eventually, one of those moments revealed something I hadn't fully recognized before: that my role inside the company had already been decided for me. Not through a conversation, not through a choice, but through years of quiet expectation. There's a particular moment in many people's lives when something that has always felt normal suddenly becomes clear. Not dramatic, not shocking, just unmistakable. For me, that moment happened during a family dinner. Every few months, we would gather at my parents' house on Sunday evenings. My father believed family meals were important, especially because the business kept everyone busy during the week. Those dinners were relaxed: food, stories, occasional debates about sports or politics, and inevitably, a conversation about the company. That night, my uncle was describing a new contract opportunity involving cross-state shipping routes. Aaron was sitting next to him, leaning forward with interest. My younger cousin Luke asked questions about expansion costs. My father listened carefully, occasionally adding his thoughts. The conversation moved naturally between them, like a rhythm they had practiced for years. I was at the table too, of course, but my role during those discussions was familiar: passing dishes, refilling water glasses, listening quietly. At one point, my mother smiled at me and said, "Glenda keeps the whole place organized. Without her, nothing would run on time." Everyone nodded approvingly. My uncle even lifted his glass slightly in my direction. "Absolutely," he said. "Every company needs someone like Glenda." The words were meant as praise, and everyone at the table believed that's exactly what they were giving. But something about the way the conversation continued afterward made the meaning clearer than it had ever been before. They returned to discussing expansion plans: new drivers, new trucks, new routes, all decisions about the future of the company, and not once did anyone ask what I thought. Not because they were intentionally excluding me, but because in their minds my place in the system had already been defined. The reliable one, the organized one, the person who makes everything run smoothly behind the scenes. I realized that evening that the company didn't see me as someone who might eventually help lead the business. I was the person who would make sure the leaders had everything they needed. It's a strange feeling when you understand the role people have assigned to you without ever discussing it openly, because confronting it would mean challenging not just a workplace structure, but a family dynamic. And families are complicated systems. I loved my father. He had worked incredibly hard to build what we had. His instincts in logistics were sharp, and his dedication to the business was something I genuinely respected. My cousins weren't arrogant people either. They simply grew up knowing that the company was something they were expected to step into. And I had grown up hearing a slightly different message. My father always told me to stay out of the family business. At the time, I believed he was protecting me. Logistics is demanding work, long hours, constant pressure, thin margins. Maybe he thought I would have a simpler life if I stayed on the edges of it, so I never pushed against that boundary. Not once. Instead, I leaned into the role everyone seemed comfortable giving me. I became extremely good at it: better systems, cleaner records, more accurate forecasting spreadsheets. If someone needed information, I could find it within seconds. Over time, people stopped checking the numbers themselves because they trusted that I had already done it. That trust felt good. But there was another side to it. The more dependable I became, the more invisible the decision-making process around me stayed, and eventually I stopped expecting to be part of it. That might sound like resignation, but it wasn't. It was simply the acceptance of the structure that existed. Or at least that's what I believed at the time. Because the moment that truly changed everything didn't come from frustration. It didn't come from ambition either. It came from something much quieter. A single afternoon, when I noticed a pattern in the company's numbers that no one else seemed to be paying attention to. And for the first time in years, I realized something unexpected. The role everyone believed I had might not actually be the role I was capable of playing. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't happen during a family argument or after some dramatic realization that everyone had underestimated me. In fact, no one else was even in the office when it happened. It was a Wednesday evening in late autumn. Most of the trucks had already returned for the day, and the warehouse lights were dimmed to their quiet after-hours glow. The hum of the refrigeration units outside created a low, steady background sound that I had heard so many times it barely registered anymore. I stayed late that night because there were a few invoice discrepancies I wanted to clean up before the monthly reports were finalized. The work itself wasn't unusual, but while reviewing the numbers, something caught my attention. One of our long-term clients, a regional retail chain, had been gradually increasing the size of their shipments over the past year. Not dramatically, just small increases each quarter. Normally, that kind of growth would be good news. More volume meant more revenue, except that the delivery routes for that client had never been adjusted to reflect the change. The trucks were carrying heavier loads, traveling longer hours, and using more fuel. But the pricing agreement hadn't been updated, which meant the margin on those shipments had been shrinking quietly for months. I stared at the spreadsheet for a long time, not because the problem was difficult to understand, but because it revealed something larger. This wasn't just a small accounting oversight, it was a structural blind spot. The people negotiating contracts weren't watching the operational details closely enough, and the people focused on operations weren't reviewing the financial structure behind those contracts. The connection between those two areas, finance and logistics, was falling through the cracks, and I was the only person who regularly looked at both. I opened another report, then another. Within half an hour, the pattern became unmistakable. 3 different contracts had the same issue: gradual growth in shipment volume without updated pricing structures. It wasn't catastrophic, but if it continued for another year, the company would be working significantly harder for less profit. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the empty office. For years, I had assumed that the people making decisions in the conference room had a clearer view of the business than I did, that they understood the system in ways I couldn't from my desk. But sitting there in the quiet glow of my computer screen, I realized something surprising. They didn't. Not because they were careless, simply because they were each focused on their own responsibilities. My father concentrated on operations. My uncle focused on partnerships. My cousins handled expansion planning. Each of them saw an important piece of the company, but none of them were watching all of it at once. I was, not by design, just by circumstance. The realization didn't make me feel powerful. If anything, it made me feel strangely calm, like discovering that a puzzle you had been assembling casually for years was finally forming a complete picture. I printed the reports and placed them neatly on my desk. The old version of me, the version who had knocked on the conference room door months earlier, might have walked down the hallway again and tried to point out the issue. But something had changed, not in the company, in me. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about whether anyone would listen. I was thinking about something much simpler: understanding, the kind that doesn't depend on approval or recognition, just clarity. And that clarity brought with it a quiet realization that surprised me. For years, I had believed I was simply maintaining the systems that kept the company organized, but now it was obvious, without intending to. I had learned how the entire business actually worked, not the version discussed in meetings, the real one, the one hidden in the numbers, the one revealed through patterns. That night, I shut down my computer, locked the office, and stepped into the cold evening air. Nothing dramatic had happened, no confrontation, no announcement. But as I walked to my car, one thought stayed with me. If I understood the company this clearly, then my silence from this point forward wouldn't come from habit anymore. It would be a choice. After that evening, the office looked exactly the same. The trucks still arrived before sunrise. The warehouse doors still rolled open with the same heavy metallic sound. The same coffee mugs appeared on the same desks every morning. No one noticed that anything had changed. And in a way, that was the most interesting part, because the only real change had happened inside my own mind. Before, my silence had been automatic. It came from habit, from family expectations, from years of believing that my role in the company was simply to keep things organized while others made the decisions. But once you realize you understand a system, silence begins to feel different. It stops being passive. It becomes intentional. I still prepared the weekly reports. I still corrected invoices and verified shipment logs. From the outside, I looked exactly the same as I always had. But internally, I had started asking different questions. No questions about what people expected from me. Questions about the structure of the business itself. For example, I began tracking certain patterns more carefully than before. Fuel fluctuations across different routes, the timing of late payments from certain clients, seasonal patterns in warehouse capacity. These weren't new tasks. They were simply deeper observations layered on top of the work I was already doing. And because everyone believed I was only handling administrative details, no one thought twice about it. Sometimes my cousin Aaron would stop by my desk again. "Do you have the route reports for Thursday?" he'd ask. I would hand him the documents. He'd glance at them briefly and nod. "Perfect. This makes everything easier." Then he'd head toward the conference room, and I'd return to my computer. But now, while watching those meetings from the outside, I noticed something else. The decisions happening in that room weren't wrong. They just weren't connected. One meeting would focus entirely on expanding routes. Another would focus on controlling expenses. Another is strengthening partnerships. Each goal made sense individually, but no one seemed to be holding the entire picture at the same time, except for the person who had access to all the data, which, ironically, was me. Still, I didn't interrupt. I didn't knock on the conference room door again. Instead, I continued doing what everyone expected me to do, quietly maintaining the systems, quietly watching the numbers. There's something powerful about being underestimated, not because it gives you some secret advantage, but because it removes pressure. When people believe you're only responsible for a small piece of a system, they rarely question what else you might be learning. Weeks passed, then months, and slowly a second realization began to form. Understanding a system is one thing, but understanding how that system could change is something entirely different. One evening, while reviewing supplier contracts, I noticed a clause in one of our long-term agreements that almost no one ever discussed. It wasn't dramatic, just a small provision about renewal timelines and pricing adjustments. But the longer I studied it, the more interesting it became. Not because it was a mistake, because it created leverage. Not in an aggressive way, more like a hinge inside the structure of the business. Something small that, if moved carefully, could shift larger things around it. I closed the document slowly and leaned back in my chair. For years, I had believed my role was simply to keep the machine running smoothly, but now I was beginning to understand something else. Sometimes the person responsible for maintaining the machine is also the person who understands how it could be redesigned. And that thought introduced a quiet new question into my mind. Not whether I could influence the company, but whether I should. Because once someone begins acting on that level of understanding, there's no easy way to return to being invisible again. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There were no secret meetings, no whispered phone calls, no sudden changes in my routine. If anyone had watched my daily schedule during those months, it would have looked exactly the same as always. I arrived early, reviewed shipment logs, updated spreadsheets, prepared reports for meetings I wasn't part of. But quietly, something new had begun happening beneath those routines. I started paying attention to time, not just how the company operated today, but how it had evolved over the years. Because the longer I studied the records sitting in our system, the more I realized the business wasn't just a collection of contracts and delivery routes. It was a history of decisions. Some care, some rushed. Some were made during moments when the company was expanding quickly, and no one had the luxury of reviewing every detail. Those moments often leave small traces behind. Clauses that remain unchanged for years, agreements that automatically renew. Operational habits that continue long after the original reason for them has disappeared. And because I was responsible for organizing nearly every document the company produced, I had access to all of it. Invoices from 5 years ago. Supplier contracts are older than some of our newer drivers. Delivery records showing exactly when certain routes became profitable, or when they quietly stopped being so. Most people in the company interacted with these documents only when they needed something specific, but I began looking at them differently. I treated them like a map. Every evening, I would take one small section of the business and follow it backward. Fuel suppliers, vehicle maintenance costs, warehouse leasing agreements, not searching for mistakes, just understanding the structure. At first, the discoveries were simple. A supplier contract that renewed automatically every 3 years. A pricing agreement that had never been renegotiated, even though shipping volume had doubled. Small things. But over time, those small details connected to each other in ways that revealed something bigger. The company had grown faster than its systems had evolved, which meant many of its most important relationships were built on assumptions that no one had re-examined in a long time. One afternoon, while reviewing a stack of archived documents, I found a file that made me pause. It was an early partnership agreement my father had signed nearly 15 years earlier. At the time, the company had been much smaller, and the agreement had helped stabilize our shipping network during a difficult expansion phase. But reading through the terms now, with the company in a completely different position, something stood out. The contract contained a clause that allowed either party to renegotiate terms under certain operational thresholds. Those thresholds had already been crossed years ago, which meant the agreement could technically be revisited. No one had done it, not because they didn't care, simply because they had moved on to newer challenges. But I didn't close the document right away. I read it again, then again, not with excitement, with patience. Because I had learned something important about leverage. It doesn't usually appear in obvious places. It appears in the details people stopped looking at. Over the following weeks, I began keeping more organized notes in the leather notebook I carried with me. Not plans, not strategies, just observations. Which contracts could be updated? Which routes depended on fragile assumptions? Which supplier relationships had grown stronger, and which had quietly weakened? And through all of this, the most interesting part was that no one noticed anything unusual. To everyone else in the office, I was still doing exactly what I had always done, maintaining records, keeping systems organized, being reliable, being invisible. But slowly, piece by piece, I was building something else. Not power, understanding, the kind that comes from seeing how every part of a structure connects to the others. And eventually, that understanding led me to a realization that changed the way I saw my place in the company entirely. Because one afternoon, while reviewing a group of financial summaries side by side, I discovered something that no one else seemed to realize yet. Something that didn't just reveal a weakness in the company's structure. It revealed an opportunity, one that would eventually force me to make a decision I had never expected to face. The discovery didn't feel dramatic. There was no moment where I sat up suddenly and thought, this changes everything. In fact, when I first saw the pattern, I assumed I had misunderstood it. It happened on a quiet afternoon while I was preparing quarterly summaries. The office was unusually calm. Most of the drivers were already on the road, and the conference room was empty after a morning meeting. I had 3 financial reports open on my screen: revenue by client, operational costs by route, supplier payment schedules. Individually, none of these reports was surprising. I had worked with them for years, but that afternoon I placed them side by side in a way I hadn't done before, and something became clear almost immediately. One of our largest suppliers, an independent fuel distribution partner, had quietly become more dependent on our company than we were on them. 15 years earlier, when the contract had been signed, they were a major regional provider, and we were still a relatively small logistics operation. Back then, the agreement had given us stable pricing in exchange for consistent volume. It had been a good deal for both sides. But businesses change. Over time, our delivery network had expanded, while their client base had gradually shrunk. A few larger shipping companies had switched to national fuel contracts, leaving smaller distributors like them increasingly reliant on long-term partnerships. And according to the payment records in front of me, our company now accounts for nearly 40% of their annual distribution volume. I stared at the number for a long moment, not because it was shocking, because it was quietly significant. In business relationships, leverage often shifts slowly, so slowly that no one notices when the balance changes. But the data was clear. The partnership that once stabilized our company had evolved into something different. They needed us more than we needed them, which meant that if our company ever decided to renegotiate the agreement, we would be negotiating from a position of strength. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the office window toward the warehouse yard. Trucks moved slowly between loading bays. Workers were securing pallets before afternoon departures. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. And that was the strange part, because the information sitting quietly on my screen represented something powerful. Not aggressive, not manipulative, just clarity. For years, everyone in the company had treated that supplier contract as fixed, something stable and unchangeable. But it wasn't. It was simply unchallenged. And the more I studied the numbers, the more certain I became of something else. If that agreement were adjusted even slightly, fuel pricing, payment timelines, delivery flexibility, the impact on our operating margins would be significant. Not explosive growth, just steady, meaningful improvement, enough to strengthen the entire structure of the business. I closed the report and rested my hands on the desk. No one else knew I had noticed this yet, and I didn't feel any urge to rush into the conference room and explain it. Months earlier, I might have done exactly that, but now I understand something different. Information doesn't become valuable the moment you discover it. It becomes valuable when you understand what it allows you to do. So I didn't celebrate. I didn't write an email. I simply opened my leather notebook and wrote down 3 short lines: the supplier's name, the current contract renewal timeline, and the renegotiation clause I had read weeks earlier. Then I closed the notebook and placed it back in my bag. Because discovering leverage is one thing, deciding how to use it is something entirely different. And for the first time since I began quietly studying the structure of the company, I realized that a moment might come when I would have to choose whether to remain exactly where everyone expected me to be, or step into a role no one had ever imagined for me. For several weeks after that discovery, I did nothing, not because I didn't know what the information meant, but because I wanted to be certain I understood the consequences of acting on it. When you grow up inside a family business, decisions rarely affect only the company. They ripple outward into relationships, expectations, and identities people have carried for years. So I waited. I continued working the way I always had, organizing reports, preparing documents, maintaining systems that no one else wanted to spend time thinking about. But quietly, I watched something else unfolding. My father had begun talking more frequently about stepping back from day-to-day operations. Not immediately, but soon enough that everyone in the family had started speculating about what the next phase of the company might look like. At dinner one Sunday evening, the conversation turned toward that topic again. Aaron believed the business should expand its delivery territory further north. Luke argued that the company needed to invest in new vehicle technology before competitors did. My uncle talked about strengthening partnerships with larger distributors. Everyone had ideas, everyone had opinions, and once again, The conversation moved easily between them. The future of the company was being discussed as if the participants were already known. I listened quietly from my seat at the table, not excluded, just outside the circle of expectation. At one point, my father looked around the table and said something that made the room momentarily quiet. "Whatever happens," he said, "the company needs stability, someone who understands how everything fits together." It was a simple comment, but hearing it after months of studying the company's structure created an unexpected feeling inside me. Because for the first time, I realized something clearly. I did understand how everything fit together. Not the theoretical version, the real one. The operational patterns, the financial pressure points, the contracts that shaped our margins. For years, I had assumed that knowledge alone didn't matter if you weren't in a position to act on it. But sitting there at that table, I began to see the situation differently. Positions inside a company are often treated as permanent, but they're not. They exist because people believe certain individuals belong in certain roles. If those assumptions never get challenged, the structure never changes. The question I was facing now wasn't about capability, it was about choice. I could continue exactly as I had for the past decade. Reliable, helpful, invisible. The company would continue operating the way it always had, with small inefficiencies and overlooked opportunities quietly shaping its future. Or I could do something else, something that wouldn't involve confrontation, something that wouldn't embarrass anyone, but something that would quietly alter the structure of the business itself. I thought about the supplier agreement again, about the renewal clause, about the leverage our company now holds without realizing it. And I understood that renegotiating that contract wouldn't just change a pricing structure, it would demonstrate something much larger, that someone inside the company had been paying attention to the entire system, not just one part of it, which meant the decision I was considering wasn't reversible. Once I stepped beyond the role everyone had assigned to me, there would be no easy way to return to being the quiet coordinator in the back office. I finished my dinner and listened to the rest of the conversation without saying much. Later that evening, after everyone had left, I sat at the kitchen table with my leather notebook open in front of me. The same 3 lines I had written weeks earlier were still there. Supplier name, renewal timeline, renegotiation clause. For a long time, I looked at those words. Then I wrote one more line beneath them, not a plan, just a decision, because the moment had arrived where remaining silent would no longer be neutral. It would be a choice. And for the first time in my life, I chose something different. The first action I took didn't involve the company at all. It started with a phone call, not to my father, not to my uncle, and not to anyone inside the office. I called a local business attorney whose name I had come across months earlier while organizing corporate records. His firm specialized in contract reviews for mid-sized companies, exactly the kind of quiet legal work most businesses rely on without thinking about it. I scheduled a consultation. Nothing urgent, just a review of a supplier agreement. When I arrived at the office a few days later, I brought only 2 things with me: a copy of the fuel distribution contract and my leather notebook. The attorney spent nearly 20 minutes reading through the document without speaking. Then he looked up at me. "Are you currently responsible for negotiating this agreement?" he asked. "No," I said calmly. "Are you planning to be?" I paused before answering. "I'm planning to understand it fully." He nodded slightly, as if that answer made sense. Then he explained something I had already suspected, but wanted to be confirmed. The renegotiation clause was completely valid. The operational thresholds listed in the contract had been exceeded several years earlier, which meant our company had the legal right to reopen the agreement at the next renewal window. More importantly, he pointed out something I hadn't considered yet. Because of the distribution percentages involved, the supplier would likely have a strong incentive to maintain the relationship, even if the terms changed. In other words, renegotiation wouldn't necessarily damage the partnership. Handled correctly, it could actually strengthen it. I thanked him, paid for the consultation, and left the office with a clear understanding of the situation. Still, I didn't rush back to the company and announce anything. Instead, I waited for the right moment. That moment arrived 2 weeks later during one of the Thursday afternoon meetings. As usual, I prepared the reports and placed them neatly in folders for the conference room. But this time, when Aaron came by my desk to collect them, I said something slightly different. "I noticed the fuel supplier contract renews next quarter," I said casually. He glanced at the folder in his hands. "Yeah, it's been pretty stable for years." "There's a renegotiation clause tied to operational thresholds," I added. "We passed those thresholds a while ago." He looked mildly surprised. "I didn't realize that." "It might be worth reviewing before the renewal date," I said. Aaron nodded thoughtfully. "Good catch. I'll mention it in the meeting." That was it. No speech, no explanation, just a quiet piece of information placed in the right place at the right time. Inside the conference room, the discussion unfolded naturally. My uncle pulled up the contract summary. My father asked a few questions about current fuel expenses. Someone suggested scheduling a formal review of the agreement before the renewal window closed. From my desk outside the room, I could hear parts of the conversation through the slightly open door. No one sounded alarmed. If anything, the tone was curious, like they had stumbled onto an opportunity they hadn't considered before. And that was exactly the point. Nothing about what I had done appeared unusual. I hadn't challenged anyone's authority. I hadn't interrupted the structure of the company. I had simply placed information into the system and allowed it to move through the channels that already existed. But inside that quiet process, something important had begun shifting. Because once the contract review started, the numbers would inevitably reveal the same pattern I had seen weeks earlier. And when that happened, one question would naturally follow. Who had been watching the details closely enough to notice it first? I continued working at my desk, organizing the next set of shipment logs. From the outside, nothing about my role had changed. But inside the conference room, the first consequences of a quiet decision had already begun unfolding, and no one yet realized how much that small adjustment would eventually ripple through the company. At first, the change was subtle enough that no one treated it like a turning point. The contract review process moved forward the way these things usually do in business, slowly, methodically, through a series of meetings and revised spreadsheets. Aaron asked me for additional fuel expense reports. My uncle requested delivery volume records going back 3 years. My father wanted route efficiency numbers tied to fuel consumption. None of those requests was unusual. They were the kind of data I had been organizing for years. The only difference now was that those pieces of information were finally being placed together in the same conversation. About a week after the review started, I overheard part of a discussion inside the conference room. The door was slightly open again, just enough for voices to carry into the hallway. These numbers don't line up with the original pricing model, my uncle said. There was a pause. Then my father spoke. How long has this been happening? Someone shuffled papers. Looks like at least 2 years. 2 years. I continued typing quietly at my desk, pretending not to hear the conversation. Inside the room, the tone shifted slightly. Not angry, just puzzled, because once the numbers were examined carefully, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Fuel usage had increased, delivery volume had grown, but the contract pricing had stayed fixed, which meant the company had gradually been absorbing extra costs without adjusting the agreement. Aaron's voice came next. We should renegotiate before the renewal window. My father didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was thoughtful rather than frustrated. Who caught this? There was a brief silence, then Aaron answered. Glenda mentioned the renegotiation clause last week. Another pause. This one is slightly longer. From where I sat outside the room, I could feel the quiet shift in the air, even without seeing their faces. Not suspicion, not disbelief, just a moment of recalibration. The idea that someone outside the usual decision circle had noticed something important. Eventually, my father spoke again. All right, he said calmly, let's review the numbers fully. The meeting continued for another hour. When the door finally opened, the conversation had moved from confusion to planning. My uncle walked past my desk carrying a folder of revised projections. Aaron stopped briefly beside me. Thanks for pointing that out, he said. Looks like it might save us a decent amount. I nodded. Glad it helped. He smiled casually and walked down the hallway. To him, it probably felt like a small administrative catch. Just another example of the quiet details I was good at noticing. But inside the conference room, something more important had begun happening. The numbers were now telling a story that everyone could see. And that story would inevitably lead to a few simple questions. Why had the contract gone unexamined for so long? How many other agreements might need reviewing? And perhaps most importantly, who in the company had the clearest view of those details? Over the next few days, more documents passed across my desk than usual. Supplier agreements, delivery volume reports, operational cost summaries. Each one was part of the larger picture that had quietly revealed itself weeks earlier. Still, no one made a dramatic announcement. No one treated the discovery as a crisis. But something had undeniably shifted. People had begun looking more closely at the information flowing through the office, and for the first time, they were starting to recognize where much of that information came from. Not from the conference room, from the quiet desk near the back window, where someone had been watching the system carefully for years. And once that realization starts forming inside a company, it becomes very difficult to ignore. The renegotiation didn't happen immediately. Business decisions rarely move that quickly, especially when they involve partnerships that have existed for more than a decade. For several weeks, the company gathered information, revised projections, updated fuel cost models, historical delivery data. Most of those documents passed through my desk before anyone else saw them. And during that time, something interesting began happening. The more the leadership team reviewed the numbers, the more they realized that the fuel contract wasn't the only agreement that had quietly drifted away from its original assumptions. It was simply the first one anyone had examined closely. Once you start looking at a system with fresh eyes, patterns appear everywhere. Another supplier agreement had renewal terms that no one had revisited in years. A warehouse leasing structure was still based on storage volumes we had already exceeded. A delivery partnership contained outdated route guarantees that no longer matched our current network. None of these were disasters, but together they revealed something uncomfortable. The company had grown faster than its decision-making habits. For years, everyone had been focused on expansion, more clients, more routes, more trucks, but the underlying agreements shaping those operations had been left mostly untouched, not neglected, just assumed to be fine. Inside the conference room, that realization slowly created a new kind of tension. Not loud tension, the quiet kind that appears when experienced people begin recognizing that something important has been overlooked. One afternoon, I heard my uncle speaking with my father after another long meeting. "We should have caught this earlier," he said. My father didn't sound defensive, just thoughtful. "Maybe," he replied, "but we were focused on growth." Another pause, then my uncle said something that lingered in the air longer than either of them expected. "Glenda saw it." Silence followed. Not awkward silence, the kind people sit with when they're rethinking something they've believed for a long time. Eventually, my father spoke again. "She's always been good with details." My uncle didn't respond immediately. When he finally did, his tone was different. "It's more than details." The conversation ended there, but over the next few days, I began noticing small changes in the way people interacted with me in the office. Not dramatic changes, just subtle adjustments. Aaron started asking my opinion more often when reviewing route reports. Luke occasionally stopped by my desk to ask where certain financial summaries were coming from. Even my uncle began including me in short discussions about supplier records when he passed through the hallway. No formal invitation to the conference room had happened yet, but the boundary around it felt less solid. At the same time, the renegotiation process with the fuel distributor had already begun. Preliminary conversations revealed exactly what the numbers had suggested. They valued the partnership enough to reconsider the pricing structure, not dramatically, but enough to rebalance the margins in our favor, which meant the agreement everyone had treated as fixed for 15 years was about to change. And once that happened, the impact would ripple through the rest of the company's financial structure. Contracts would be reviewed more carefully, operational assumptions would be questioned. The quiet habits that had guided decision-making for years would no longer feel quite as reliable. In other words, the system was already shifting, and systems rarely return to their previous shape once that kind of shift begins. That's why the title of this part of the story might sound harsher than the reality felt inside the office. No one panicked. No one blamed each other. But there was a growing recognition that something important had already passed a certain point. The company was beginning to see itself differently, and once people start asking new questions about how things work, it becomes impossible to pretend that the old assumptions still explain everything. By the time the final contract revisions were ready for review, one fact had become quietly obvious to everyone involved. The person who first noticed the problem wasn't someone in the conference room. It was the person who had spent years sitting just outside it. And that realization made the next conversation unavoidable, not emotional, not dramatic, but honest. Because eventually, someone had to acknowledge what had changed. The conversation happened on a quiet Monday morning, not during a meeting, not during a family dinner, just a simple moment in the office when the hallway was calm and most of the drivers were already out on their routes. I was reviewing delivery confirmations when my father stopped beside my desk. "Glenda," he said gently, "do you have a minute?" I looked up and nodded. "Of course." He didn't gesture toward the conference room the way he normally would when something formal needed discussion. Instead, he pulled the chair from the desk beside mine and sat down. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just looked around the office, at the rows of filing cabinets, the computer screens, the stacks of documents that had quietly passed through this space for years. Then he placed a folder on the desk between us. It was the revised supplier agreement, the one everyone had been reviewing for weeks. "We finalized the new terms this morning," he said. I nodded slightly. That's good." He studied my face for a moment, the way parents sometimes do when they're reconsidering something about their child that they thought they understood completely. You were the one who noticed the clause first, he said. It wasn't a question, just an acknowledgement. Yes, I replied calmly. Another pause. My father leaned back slightly in the chair. For years, he said slowly, I thought keeping you away from the pressure of the business was the right decision. His voice wasn't defensive. If anything, it sounded reflective. I know, I said. And maybe it was, he continued. At least at the time. He tapped the folder lightly with one finger. But this situation made something clear. He looked directly at me now. You understand the company in ways I didn't realize. The words hung in the air for a moment. There was no tension in them, no accusation, just a quiet recalibration of reality. I didn't rush to respond. Finally, I said the simplest thing that felt true. I've been watching it for a long time. He nodded slowly. I can see that now. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The office around us continued its normal rhythm, phones ringing occasionally, printers humming softly, footsteps moving down the hallway. Then my father asked a question he had never asked before. Why didn't you say something earlier? It wasn't asked sharply, just with genuine curiosity. I considered the question carefully. Because it wasn't my role, I said. He exhaled quietly. That's on me. I shook my head slightly. No, I said. That's just how the company grew. Another moment passed. Then my father closed the folder and stood up. Before walking away, he said something simple that carried more weight than any formal announcement could have. We're reviewing several other agreements next week. He looked at me again. You should be in that meeting. There was no ceremony in the statement, no dramatic shift in tone, just a quiet correction to the structure that had existed for years. I nodded once. All right. He gave a small, thoughtful smile and walked back toward his office. From the outside, nothing about the company looked different that day. The trucks kept moving. The phones kept ringing. The spreadsheets kept updating. But a boundary that had existed for most of my life had quietly disappeared. Not through confrontation, not through proving anyone wrong, just through a moment of clarity that neither of us could ignore anymore. The first meeting I attended in the conference room wasn't dramatic. No announcement, no special introduction. My father simply said, Glenda has been reviewing some of the supplier agreements with me. And then the meeting continued. For years, I had prepared the reports for these conversations. Now, for the first time, I was part of the conversation itself. At first, I mostly listened. Listening had always been my advantage. When my father eventually asked, Glenda, what do you see in these numbers? The room became quiet for a moment. I looked at the reports and answered calmly. Our contracts still assume we're the smaller partner, but the company has grown. If we update them to reflect our current position, the margins improve. No one argued. My uncle nodded. Aaron leaned back in his chair and said, That actually explains a lot. And just like that, the discussion moved forward. No one treated my perspective as unusual. They treated it as useful. Over the following months, more agreements were reviewed and small adjustments strengthened the company. Nothing about it felt like a takeover. It was simply the business evolving. The biggest change wasn't the room I sat in. It was that people finally understood something I had quietly known for years. I didn't just organize the system. I understood it. People often expect stories like this to end with confrontation, but that isn't what happened. No one lost. No one was humiliated. What changed inside our company happened quietly, through patience, through observation, through understanding how the system really worked. My family was never trying to hold me back. They simply followed the roles that had always existed. And sometimes those roles stay in place until someone calmly shows that the structure can grow. The biggest lesson I learned is this. Being underestimated can feel frustrating, but it also gives you time to learn what others overlook. And when the right moment comes, clarity speaks louder than proving anyone wrong. Now I'm curious about your experience. Have you ever been underestimated, only for people to later realize you understood more than they expected? If you'd like, share your story. Quiet moments like that often reveal the most about who we really are.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.